my pleasure to welcome you to our first bicentennial faculty lecture series. This six-part series will highlight some of the college's best-known faculty members and cover a variety of topics in the fine arts, humanities, natural sciences, and social sciences. Tonight, we're joined by Professor Jon Tazewell and his students in the class, August Wilson on stage and screen. A 1984 graduate of Kenyon, Tazewell is an award-winning writer and director who has been teaching at the college since 1997. He won the Trustees Excellence in Teaching Award in 2004 and was named the Thomas S. Turgeon Professor of Drama and Film in 2008. Tazewell won the Distinguished Service Award from the college in 2018. Tazewell earned his Master's of Fine Arts degree from California Institute of the Arts in directing for theater, video, and cinema, where he studied with renowned director Alexander McKendrick. After Tazewell returned to join the Kenyon faculty, he developed and established the Kenyon Film Major. Jon also serves as the Chair of American Studies. I'll turn it over to Jon.
Hello, my friends. It's nice to see you all, and to my students who we were supposed to have class this morning, but I am down in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, acting as an external examiner for the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. So I'm busy doing that, but it gave me the opportunity to do this bicentennial lecture, and so I'm glad to have you all with us. Just a quick intro to what we're doing, and then we'll kind of jump in to the show or to the class. This class is a double-listed class, so it is an American Studies class. It's also a drama class. It functions in both respects. So some of the students that are in the class are here as American Studies students, and some of the students that are in the class are taking it as a drama lit class for their drama major. So it will serve both purposes. And it also gave me an opportunity to do some really interesting things, especially to talk about August Wilson, who was one of my favorite playwrights, American playwrights. And we're actually reading the whole century cycle. So if you're not familiar with August Wilson, he is an African-American playwright. He wrote 10 plays that covered each of the decades of the 20th century. So starting in the aughts, the 1900s, and then on through. We are in our fifth week, so we're actually in the 40s, if you will. And the play that we're going to talk about tonight is Seven Guitars, which is the play that he wrote about in the 40s. We're not reading the plays in the order in which he wrote them, because I thought it would be more interesting for us to read the plays in the order in which they cover the 20th century and see what those kind of connections are and what he was trying to do as he was revealing African-American history through these plays in the context of each of the decades. And we're finding some interesting things. There are some things that you should know, again, if you are not as familiar with August Wilson. One of them is sort of the four B's, and we've really mostly focused on sort of three of those, but blues is a very important aspect of inspiration to August Wilson. So we'll talk about some blues. Romare Bearden is another one, and we'll talk a great deal about that. We do a lot of talking about art and you know, other things, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I'm going to sort of jump on into class, and then we'll talk about it. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share. There is a place at one point, which I'm keeping my fingers crossed, because there's a place where I'm going to ask you to contribute to a word cloud. But I've never tried it on a Google slide. So we're going to see how it works. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. We'll just do it just by voice or something like that. But let me first get my my Google slide presentation going, and then I'm going to share it with you so that you can all see it. So I hope you can see this.
Thought I heard Buddy Bolden say, you nasty but you dirty, take it away. You're terrible, you're awful, take it away. I thought I heard him say, I thought I heard Buddy Bolden shout, open up that window and let that bad air out. Open up that window and let that foul air out. Yes, I thought I heard Buddy Bolden say.
Okay, so I'm just starting you with a little bit of that. Anybody know why I decided I was gonna play that particular song as the introduction? If I don't see your hand, because I'm sharing my screen, just unmute yourself and speak up. My students certainly should know why we're playing that song. And I might have to pick on somebody. I might have to pick on Soren because I see his face first. All right. What's up, Soren? Tell me,
Is it
tell me
enough?
what's happening.
Because it's in the play.
Okay, so who's singing it in the play?
Hadley.
Okay, great. So we're gonna get to who Headley is in a second, but Buddy Bolden, who's Buddy Bolden? Anybody know who Buddy Bolden is? Yes, Lance, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself, please.
I unmuted myself. Buddy Bolden played a mean cornet, I believe.
Buddy Bolden played a mean cornet. Indeed, he did. This image that you see on the screen is an image of Buddy Bolden's band. He is in the back row, sort of second from the far left, holding his cornet, and is in many ways considered to be the father of jazz, incorporating some blues style into his early New Orleans jazz music. There was perhaps it is thought that there is a cylinder recording of Buddy Bolden's band, but it has probably been destroyed and no one really has any access to that. So that song actually is a song that is by this band and this man here at the piano, Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton is also in some ways considered to be the father of jazz, but I think as an homage to his predecessor, Buddy Bolden, he wrote this song about Buddy Bolden. I thought I heard Buddy Bolden say, and in that song we hear, you know, some of what Jelly Roll may have imagined or may have heard Buddy Bolden say. So that song, of course, shows up in the play Seven Guitars through the character, as Soren said, who sings that song sort of throughout the play. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the sort of historical context. And so the play takes place in 1948. So we're going to start there and just talk a little bit about that first. So we know that this is a post-World War II play. We've already been through, my class, we've already been through Gem of the Ocean, which is the play that takes place in the 1900s. We've been through Two Trains Running, and we've been through Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and now we're on to Seven Guitars. And so we're past World War II, but there's some things that I want to talk about with regard to this, because there's some important stuff that sort of contextualizes this moment in history and contextualizes some of the things that are happening in the play. First, Truman's Executive Order 9981, which was in July of 1948. Anybody know what that executive order did? Speak up. don't see any hands yet. So, okay. So Truman's Executive Order 9981 was the desegregation of the armed forces. So prior to July 1948, African Americans had served in every American war since the Revolution, but they served in segregated companies until this year. So this is sort of an important year in respect of desegregation and the move toward desegregation generally in the United States of America, but it starts really in the military, and it starts with Truman's executive order. So that's something that's sort of important to sort of think about in terms of context. But I'm going to jump back a little bit and think about some earlier context and talk about Special Field Order number 15 that was made by General Tecumseh Sherman after his march to the sea. Anybody know what Special Field Order number 15 is and why it might be of interest? Speak up.
40 acres and a mule.
40 acres and a mule. Thank you very much. 40 acres and a mule. So we commonly know of this as 40 acres and a mule, which was a decision that was made to redistribute 400,000 acres of land really in South Carolina and Georgia and the Low Country, and give 40 acres to each of the sort of formerly enslaved people who had occupied that land as enslaved people, or people who who continued to occupy that land because they had either been enslaved on those plantations or what have you. So 40 acres, the mule kind of came later, right? The mule was actually not part of the order, but there was a decision to collect all of these mules and also provide a mule. So this decision, of course, was the result of a conversation that Edwin Stanton and Sherman, General Sherman, had with local black preachers. So anybody know who Edwin Stanton is? Secretary of War. Anything else?
Kenyon graduate.
Yes, well, almost. We do call him a Kenyon graduate. He attended Kenyon for about 3 semesters from 1831 to 1832. He was a member of the Philomathesian Society. He was a staunch abolitionist. And so here he is pictured next to Tecumseh Sherman on the right and Stanton on the left. But yes, so we have a Kenyon connection in a way to the 40 acres and a mule. It was really because of Edwin Stanton and General Sherman that and of course the preachers from the area who did this truly remarkable, miraculous redistribution of wealth. And we are still trying to get back to getting our 40 acres and a mule. So what happened to the 40 acres and a mule? Where did it go? Oh, I didn't mean to go there. Sorry. So President Andrew Jackson decided to give back the land to the Confederates who had the land prior to that. And so some of the reason that the idea of the 40 acres and a mule still exists and perpetuates is, again, because of this idea that this false promise, this lost promise, still remains. Some of you may know that Spike Lee's production company is called 40 Acres and a Mule, which is obviously a call back to that. So why is that moment? Why is that issue, that context important within the context of this play? Any of my students here that can share why they think that might actually be an important contextual moment? Who's here? I saw Ethan. Ethan, you want to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about why?
Well, I forget which character it is if it's Headley, or it might be Headley,
It's
who,
Headley.
who wants to buy a plantation
Right.
of his own. So
Right.
that kind of relates to that want of taking back the land.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so we hear Headley say multiple times, right, this idea that he wants a plantation. He wants a plantation. He's going to become a big man. And so it relates in many ways to this idea that there's this promise of land that's going to be there, and that the promise of land is really a measure of freedom and a measure uh, of of humanity and a measure of Americanness and a measure, it is the promise of the American dream that is sort of never realized. So we hear Headley say this multiple times, and it really comes from this idea, right? This idea that there was 40 acres that was promised and then never realized. Okay, so let's talk about that, and then let's do another piece of context. So in the play, of course, they are getting ready to listen to the fight between Joe Louis and Roy Cohn. And that fight actually takes place on December 10th, 1948. So in some real way, we can identify and locate this play, at least taking place for part of the play, on December 10th, 1948. Lewis fights Roy Cohn three times and beats him 3 times. And the last time that he beats him is on this night, on December 10th, 1948. And he doesn't fight. Cohn doesn't fight anymore after that point. Both Joe Louis and Cohn are veterans. They both serve in the Army, and they both leave their championship status to go into the Army and fight in the war, and then come back. And when they first fight in their first meeting, they both are kind of considered to be a little rusty, and part of the reason that they're a little rusty is because they've been away from the ring for a little while. So you sort of hear this in the context of the play. So just sort of putting that in there as well. So 7 guitars. Who are the 7 guitars? And I say who because it's the characters, of course, in the play. And let's talk a little bit about who they are and what that is. All right, so I'm gonna call on let's see, Hannah's here. Let me see. Hannah, so tell us a little bit about each one of these characters, if you will.
Me? Okay.
Yes.
All
you.
right. Okay. So Floyd Barton is a blues musician, as it says, and he recorded one song, I believe, that
Okay.
like got really famous.
Right.
And then
One that
he
we
spent
know of, yeah, right. One that we know of in the play. Yeah.
yeah. And but then he went to the working house, right? Or
Yeah. So what is that? What do you mean? But what is that? What
is
what
was
happened?
that like kind of like was that like he was like arrested or something? Yeah,
Yeah,
and
he was
then
arrested. Yeah.
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 Um
For what?
yeah, I forgot, but uh I don't think, oh wait, was
Vagrancy, right?
Yeah. Vagrancy. Yeah. So he was hanging around, right? He didn't have a job. He was hanging around. He wasn't doing anything. He didn't commit any crime per se, except that he was not otherwise occupied, you know, he wasn't employed and otherwise occupied, right? Okay. And what else? What else about, we're going to get to what happens to Floyd, but tell me a little more about what we know about Floyd.
Floyd always has a gun on him, right? The 38 that he keeps talking about.
Yes, he carries a 38. And what else did
he
you have?
he wants. Oh, I
Go
was
ahead.
gonna say he wants to go to Chicago. Um,
He wants to go to Chicago. Why does he want to go to Chicago?
because they say that well, the main reason is that he's gonna get another opportunity to record a song.
Great. Excellent. Okay, so we'll leave Floyd there for a moment and we'll come back to him in a minute. All right. So number 2, who's Vera? Who wants to talk about Vera?
I think Vera is Floyd's sort of on and off partner because he went off to Chicago to record, and he sort of left Vera behind. But after he got back from jail, he sort of returned to Vera, so they have kind of a complicated relationship.
Great. Good. Yeah. Their relationship is complicated because we get this sense, right, that Floyd is not very faithful and that but while he's there, do you get the impression as you were reading it, I'm curious about what your impression was about Floyd and his feelings about Vera and whether they seem true.
It was honestly hard to tell for me. I couldn't really say one way or the other.
Why do you say that?
Just because from what I've heard about, it's just the fact that he sort of left and came back, that we can't really know for sure whether he's being faithful, because if he's done that in the past, who's to say he doesn't have like maybe another partner right now that he might be seeing and nobody knows.
Great. And is there anything that complicates it while we, in the context of the play? Is there anything that seems to complicate his feelings?
I think, well, the fact that he is about to leave for Chicago, he asks her first, but then she says no, and he like immediately is asking everyone else like to come with him.
If they'll go with him. Okay.
Yeah. So that seems a little bit like he's just trying to see who will like accompany him. It seems more like he just doesn't want to be alone on like when he leaves.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to, we'll come to this, but I'm curious about what your impressions were about Floyd's relationship with Ruby. Let's hold on to it. Let's carry on with the rest of the 7 guitars and we'll come back to Ruby because she's number 7. Okay, so what about King Headley? And so I put King Headley there specifically as King Headley because he says that's what his name is, right? He says his name is King Headley. Who's King Headley?
He's one of the people who lives in the house. And he is kind of like he has tuberculosis and he is refusing to go to the sanatorium. So it feels a little bit like he's kind of like skeptical of white people and is like mainly just focused. He's the one that's like focused on getting his own plantation and like kind of just doing his thing.
Great. So let's talk about this sanitarium and that whole issue, and let's talk about that suspicion and fear, and that has some other context as well, some other historical context as well. So why does he feel that way? What is his concern about it? I mean, everybody has concern perhaps about being sick and going to the doctor or going to the hospital, but why is this, what is this about? Why is this more particular in some ways, especially within the context of African American history?
Because up until very recently, as we learn in the play, most a lot of hospitals would not treat Black people. They only treated white people.
Right. Great. Yes, exactly. And anything else? You all of you other people who are in the room, you can contribute as well.
He doesn't trust white doctors.
Why? How come? Aside from the fact they didn't want to treat African Americans, but any particular historical moments that might be, yeah, Emily?
Is this in time for Tuskegee?
Well, even if it's not in time exactly in the same moment, I think that the Tuskegee experiment is an important moment to think about, because I think that August Wilson is not writing this in 48. He's writing this in a context of a contemporary audience that would really be aware of the Tuskegee experiment. And so that resonates, that idea resonates, right? The idea that there was, I assume most of you know that the Tuskegee experiment was an experiment in which they chose to treat some and chose to not treat some African American men who were diagnosed with syphilis in order to see what the result of that would be. I think that legacy of distrust among African Americans towards the medical community is something that is still here in our present day, and is something that I think that Wilson wants to kind of call to when he's talking about Headley's reticence to go to the sanitarium and be treated for tuberculosis. So okay, so we have that. I want to also say,
Is there a quick question?
Sure.
Could I ask? Sorry, this is Lindsay. I'm a much
Lindsay.
older student, and I have not read the play, but I am aware of Henrietta Lacks and the Hella.
Yep.
Which I had to look it up. It's after it's 51, but he's writing backwards, right? So he
Yes.
would have known. So could that have imbued his thoughts, even though it wouldn't have imbued these people's because it happened afterwards?
Right. The characters aren't aware of some of the context that we're aware of, but but Wilson is, he's a smart playwright. He's not writing for the characters, he's writing for us, and he knows that we have context that they don't have, and that's fine. So, as these things reflect, as we reflect on what's happening, we also are we can't help but bring into the context of the play our understanding of American history that may come after these moments, right? He's not sort of writing in a way that that needs to be factually true. And in fact, in the very beginning, and I think I'll read this for you. He says, if I can find it, in the kind of very beginning of the play. It's a note from the playwright. He says, despite my interest in history, I have always been more concerned with culture, and while my plays have an overall historical feel, their settings are fictions, and they are peopled with invented characters whose personal histories fit within the historical context in which they live. I've tried to extract some measure of truth from their lives as they struggle to remain whole in the face of so many things that threaten to pull them asunder. I am not a historian. I happen to think that the content of my mother's life, her myths, her superstitions, her prayers, the contents of her pantry, the smell of her kitchen, the song that escaped from her sometimes parched lips, her thoughtful repose, and pregnant laughter are all worthy of art. Hence, 7 Guitars. So, and that was written, this was written, of course, in 1995. So I think he's saying, yes, of course, these historical things do have resonance, and there were other circumstances, of course, historical circumstances, many that are not documented, that were as awful and tragic as some of the things that he is referencing in his plays. So we have that, but I also want to push in a little bit on questions about, and we'll get to this when we try to do our word cloud, whether or not this play, and I'm asking specifically for my students to think about this, but anybody who's read the play, whether or not this play is dealing with mental illness, because there's some behaviors that Headley exhibits that don't necessarily feel entirely normal in the sort of a traditional normal sense, whatever normal means. But I want you to think a little bit about whether or not he's reflecting on questions of mental illness also. All right, so let's carry on with our other guitars, our other characters. Who's Louise? Where are my students?
Louise is the owner of the apartment, right?
Yes. I mean, she manages it. I don't know that she really owns it, but she certainly manages it. But she's in charge of the place, of the boarding house. Okay. And anything else about Louise?
I remember that in the first scene that we see Louise, it says that she's got tension with Floyd.
Tension with Floyd. What do you mean by tension? A tension with Floyd. Why does she have a tension with Floyd?
Well, my first thought was that maybe it was some sort of romantic tension, and so I couldn't really suss out if that was what was going on or not. So I don't know either way.
Yeah, I don't get the impression that that's what it is, but I think you're right that she does have a tension with Floyd. But she's friends with Vera. So maybe that's really the source of the tension. Her tension is not so much about her liking, or I mean, or at least her being interested in Floyd, but her tension is in being defending Vera, you could say. But she does have a love interest. Who's her love interest?
It's Headley, isn't it?
Headley. Headley is her love interest.
Yeah.
It never really gets realized, perhaps, or at least not that we know of, but she's got a thing for Headley. So we'll keep that in the space because it's going to matter later on. All right, so let's carry on. A couple other characters. Red Carter, he's just the drummer, and we sort of hear him, and Canewell, who's the harmonica player, and then Ruby. I want to get to Ruby. So Ruby is Louise's niece, but what else do we discover about Ruby?
She's pregnant, and she's not sure
She's
who
pregnant.
the is.
Okay, that's one thing, right? She's pregnant. And
Well, then she's got this sensuality that seems to drive all the men in the backyard crazy.
she seems like, as soon as she walks in the room, as soon as she walks in the yard, everybody's turns their head. Okay, so she's got the sensuality about her, something about her that makes everybody want to look at her. Okay, which brings me back to this question about Floyd and wondering whether or not Floyd has a thing for Ruby. But we discover that when Floyd takes her around town, Floyd doesn't take her around town and say and give the impression that he's involved with her. He takes her around town and he says that she's his cousin. So I'm not sure that there's any real romantic tension that's going on, but I might wonder whether or not Vera thinks that there might be some romantic tension that's going on. And I think that creates some conflict that might be interesting to see on stage. Also, what else do we also discover about Ruby? What does Ruby do with Headley?
Well, she wants to marry him.
She does kind of say that, but there's a moment, and I'll see if I can find it here, where I'll describe it for you. Ruby is in the yard with Headley, and let's see if I can find it. I'm sorry. She says, or Wilson describes it as that Ruby gives herself to Headley to relieve this lust that he has, and that he seems unable to control. And it's not really clear what happens. It's a sexual act that happens in the yard, but it isn't clear that there's anything more that happens in that moment. But she also decides that she's going to do something about this child that she's going to have. What does she decide to do about the child?
She says she's going to tell Headley that it's his, even though she knows that it's not.
She's going to tell Headley that it's his. So for anybody else who's aware of Wilson's work, you'll know that there's another play called King Headley II. King Headley II is Ruby's child that she has, and she names him after King Headley. So Headley becomes the spiritual father of Ruby's child. And we'll get to that story later. But it's just something that you're aware of, that and we've seen Wilson do this before, where he has characters that he populates in his plays, as he did with Rutherford Seelig, for example, in Gem of the Ocean, and comes back in Two Trains, and we see those characters show up. The same will happen here, where we have Ruby showing up with her son, King Headley II. Okay, so just keep that in your mind. All right, so we have all of that that's sort of there. Those are the people. So I'm going to ask you, if you will, and see if we can make this work. And I don't know that we can, but there should be both a little web address up at the top of this slide, and also a QR code that you should be able to see. And I'm going to ask you to go to that web address, and if you can, see whether or not it will work. Use that to create a word cloud. And what I want you to think about are some of the themes that are in the play. Some of the things, if you've read the play, or even if you just are listening to this conversation, or if you know anything about the play, what things come to mind? What thoughts come to mind that are thematic ideas, or historic ideas, or anything that sort of pops into your head? See whether or not we get anything. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, we'll just do it by voice. Oh, cool. All right, it's happening. It's happening. It's happening. Here we go.
John, can you put a link to it in the chat?
I sure can.
I tried typing in the polev.com, but I didn't get it right.
Sean, I think we have somebody in the waiting room, if you want to let them in.
Yeah, sure.
Nice. Interesting. This is an interesting. All right, carry on, keep on, but let's talk a little bit about what we got in our word cloud here. History and magical seem to be winning the day right now. And I want to talk about magical because that really does get us, especially starting out with regard to the plot and the beginning of the plot. Somehow I seem to be winning the day too, so I don't know what that is, but that's okay. Let's talk a little bit about magical, because we've been talking a bit about that during the course of the semester, and Wilson's use of magical realism as a stylistic choice in some of the other plays that we've talked about. We saw that in Gem of the Ocean, certainly. And in some ways, when we saw it in the piano lesson that we just sort of read, at least in this idea of ghosts and ghost stories and those kinds of things. So let's talk a little bit about that for a moment with regard to this particular play. Where do we see this magical realism take place, and how does it sort of appear in the context of this particular play? Or does it? Anybody who put magical in there want to say anything about that? Hannah, give it a go.
Yeah, I didn't put magical in there, but I think one of the main things are like the angels that they talk about in the beginning and the end.
Yeah. That's exactly. Oh, so say something about that. Say, so what was your impression about the angels and what Vera sees when what Vera talks about seeing at the funeral?
Um, I they seem to be like I know one character interpreted them as someone who was like part of the funeral house. They seem to, so it was like a bit confusing, but she said that um they were like men in black suits.
Right.
Yeah, and then like they carried Floyd away like up
Yeah.
to heaven.
Yeah. And so it becomes it also becomes this kind of weird thing, not only is it confusing, because I think you're right. I mean, it's not explicit. I think Wilson intentionally leaves it ambiguous. Who are these people? Where do they come from? Are they angels? What does it mean? Um, and I don't think we are necessarily supposed to know and define it, right? That we see them, and even there's disagreement among the characters about whether or not they are indeed angels, whether they were even there, how they got there. Vera kind of describes them coming down from the sky and then taking them up into the sky, and there's all of this ambiguity about, and that's of course in the very first scene of the play. And that's kind of how we get there, right? We start with this magical realism. We start with this idea that somebody we don't even know, Floyd, at that point in the play, has died, and that there are these angels that have come down in these black suits and have taken him up into the sky. And it may say in context something about how Vera feels about Floyd. It may say something about the way in which Wilson wants us to think about this death and what's going on. Because as we're going to get to, and I got to hurry up because I only have 15 minutes, we're going to get to this idea that, of course, the death of Floyd is a tragic but somewhat mysterious kind of thing. So let's hold on to magical, because I think that's really important. History, obviously, still winning the day. Some of the other things that I think are really interesting that have popped up here: spiritualism. There's a lot of biblical reference that goes on within the context of this play, and there's also, as we've talked about, in the same way that there are in other plays, just like the piano lesson, a kind of tension between what would be considered sort of traditional Christian spiritualism and something else that is not necessarily directly religiously affiliated. But there's definitely some sense of spiritualism, some sense of the supernatural, some sense of some power that is beyond the scope of the world in which the characters live. So that's something that I think is there. Um, Enslavement, certainly. Rage. I'm going to get to rage in a minute. and some of the others. So really good stuff that I think is that's in our word cloud. Some of the things that are missing that I think that I'm curious about, because there's something about morality and justice that I think I would add to this word cloud, right? The idea that there's something about morality. What is it to be moral? What is it to be righteous within the context of the world in which these characters live? Both from the sort of societal sense of what is the moral, righteous thing, especially for people who are African American living in the United States of America at this time, and what does that mean? But also within the context of this community and what happens, the killing of the rooster, that brings us back to magical and spiritualism in another kind of way, but also brings us to this question of morality and whether or not there is something immoral that is sort of happening, and of course the morality or immorality of Floyd's death. Somebody did put justice down there, so I didn't see that, but justice is another thing, right? What is just? What does it mean to be just? What's the justice that Headley is looking for? And what is the justice that Floyd is looking for? And what happens? What are the circumstances that cause them to lose out on whether they get that justice or that righteousness? Okay, great. So let's move on, and let's see if I can go to the next. So I want to highlight some photos as we talk a little bit through the plot. As Hannah pointed out, we start out in the very first scene, and we know that Floyd has died, and they've returned from the funeral, and we hear some descriptions of what happens in the funeral. In these photographs that I'm incorporating into this slideshow, I'm particularly highlighting the photographs of Teenie Harris, who is a Pittsburgh-based photographer, and who documented much of the life of African Americans, and who is another artist who had a good deal of influence on August Wilson. So we start out with that as our sort of beginning, and then of course we hop back and go back in time after the first scene and jump back to before Floyd is dead. So it's a kind of a curious beginning to the play, because the play, now that we know that Floyd is dead and that these characters are mourning his death, and then we jump back in the second scene and we discover, oh, now we're back at a moment when Floyd is alive. So the juxtaposition of those two scenes, the first two scenes, makes us think, okay, so then this is a mystery play, right? The play is in many ways a play about how we are supposed to figure out, how did Floyd die? If that's what Wilson sets us up with in the first scene, and then we see Floyd in the very next scene, then our job as audience must be, how did Floyd die, right? That's the whole point. So, it's not the sort of the suspense that you would get if we, or the surprise, I should say. It's not the surprise that you would get. And, Hitchcock, if anybody's a Hitchcock fan, knows that Hitchcock describes the difference between the surprise and suspense, right? So there's no surprise. We already know Floyd is dead. Now it's really the suspense of keeping us on the edge of our seat to try and figure out, well, how did he die? Okay, so we start out with that first scene. The play takes place in the Hill District, for those of you who are unaware, and that is, of course, also August Wilson's kind of home neighborhood, his childhood neighborhood. So it takes place in the Hill District, and Ruby, of course, sort of indicates that when she comes and talks about how she can't be walking up these hills, so we get this flavor. But I just wanted to show you sort of this photograph, because it gives you perhaps an impression of what kind of neighborhood are we talking about? What kind of yard are we talking about? Where are they sitting? This is so that they're sitting in the yard and they're hanging out in the yard. but we know that they are in this kind of community. So, you know, if you look at some of these places, especially up the hill a little bit, you see the exterior staircase that walks all the way up to the top of this multi-level home. But it has a yard in the front, and it's not a big yard, but there's a yard where they might hang out. So there's just giving you some sense of the kind of location that they might be in. And the entire play, as Wilson often does, takes place in one location. He's pretty good about unity of time and space, you know, sort of this Aristotelian idea that, you know, and that's not only an interesting playwriting pattern or technique, but it's great for people who are actually going to put on a play, because you don't have to build lots of different kinds of scenery. So we have that. Some other things that are there that he talks about. So they talk about going to this club where they're going to play. This one is the Crawford Grill, which is an actual blues jazz club in Pittsburgh. And this is Woogie Harris, who's Teenie Harris's brother, who's playing this mirrored piano that is on a platform that sits on top of the bar. So I thought that'd just sort of be an interesting photo for you to sort of think about, because we're thinking about, okay, so what is this kind of place when they go to this club and they're going to play? Where are they going to play? It's going to be a bar. People are going to be there. They're going to play in the club. And, you know, when they go, they dress up and they, you know, they get all gussied up, and that's the plan. Okay. No, I don't want to do that one. So any rate, now let's talk a little bit about what's happening in this play. Whose play is it? I always ask this question of my students, and they have to figure that out. Anybody want to venture a guess? Whose play is it? And what do I mean by that?
Well, it means who's the protagonist, essentially. Whose play is it? So who's the main character, so to speak. And I personally think it's Floyd, because without Floyd, I don't think the play would be the same, because it's kind of a mystery about Floyd, and he's sort of the center of the action, because he's the one who wants to go to Chicago, and he's the one who has a lot of or tension, if you will, between all of the other characters. And through Floyd, I think all of the characters are connected wherever they may be coming from. So that's my thought.
I think that's a good argument. I'm not entirely convinced yet, Soren, but I love that you took that stand. I think that's great. Anybody want to argue for anybody else?
I would argue that it's Headley's play, because it's like sort of him wanting the money that he thinks his dad sent Buddy Bolden to bring him in like a dream or whatever, and like throughout the play, that's sort of driving his actions, and then that's what ultimately leads him to kill Floyd. So I feel like his objective is what drives the action in that sense.
So this is perfect. You know, I love these guys. You know, so this is perfect. So those two characters are really going to be at the heart of this play, right? So, you know, Floyd has a clear objective and wants to get to Chicago and is trying to get everybody to go to Chicago, and so that's clearly part of it. Headley has this objective. He wants this money, and he's trying to get this money that Buddy Bolden is supposed to bring him. That brings me to the question of whether or not this is a play about mental illness, because, of course, he doesn't really think Buddy Bolden is going to bring him money, does he? Or maybe he does. Does he really think that Floyd is Buddy Bolden? What is happening with that? But that action then causes him to kill Floyd. Now, here's the tricky thing. Floyd is dead at the beginning of the play. This is sort of like Citizen Kane. If anybody's ever watched the movie by Orson Welles, Citizen Kane is dead at the very beginning of the movie. Well, if it's a movie about Citizen Kane, Charles Foster Kane, How can it be a movie about Charles Foster Kane if we already know the end of the story and we already know that Charles Foster Kane is dead? How is Charles Foster Kane going to have some kind of recognition and reversal? He can't. He's dead. So, same thing is true here. Can Floyd actually have some kind of recognition and reversal? Does Floyd have a recognition and reversal? Maybe. Maybe he has a recognition when he takes the money, finds the money, or the money is revealed to be under the plant, and he's counting the money, and we discover something about some of the things that he's done, but moments after that, he dies. And so does he really get to have a reversal? Now, Headley, on the other hand, has an objective, has a discovery. Here's the money, makes a choice, has a kind of reversal that causes the end of the play. I'm not going to say where I would fall, but I think those two characters and the tension between those two characters is really ultimately the question. And if you're going to put the play on, you kind of have to make some decision about which of these two characters it's going to be. Everybody else is sort of filling in the gap. None of the other characters really have a sort of a significant objective and then transformation that's going to carry us through the play. So it's really either going to have to be Floyd or it's going to have to be Headley. But when we're dealing with Headley, we have other problems to deal with. We have the problem of wondering, does Headley really know what Headley is doing? And does Headley do what Headley is doing in order to really achieve his true objective, or is he misguided by some kind of mental illness? Last moment. So, in the end, and at the beginning, because we start the play with the beginning and with the end, really, in the end, what does everyone know about Floyd's death? And who knows what? It's not explicit, so this is an interpretation. This is what you, as playmakers, need to decide. What does everyone know about Floyd's death, and who knows what? How did Floyd die?
Headley killed him.
Who knows?
Headley.
Is that
And
is he the only one?
I think so.
Okay, that's a perfectly reasonable choice, right? But it's a little bit odd. Here, Floyd is dead with a big gash through his throat. Everybody knows that Headley has a machete, and nobody suspects Headley. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Sean. I enjoyed the night. We'll see my students on Friday.